G'day mates, it's Busta here. So before the video starts, I just wanted to let you guys know that I recently started live streaming on Twitch and created a Discord channel to chat with you all through. So a few Hive members helped me out by doing a test stream with me the other day, and everything seems to be working out well, so I thought I would leave a link below to my Discord server and Twitch channel so that you guys can join in with the rest if you would like. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the video, and without further ado, let's begin. This happened when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was at a rather large toy store with my dad and sister, who was 2 years older than me, so that I could pick out a birthday present for a friend of mine. My dad and I were looking at the Lego they had available, while my sister was shuffling around, bored out of her mind. At some point, she wandered away. I was looking at the box of a castle set, wishing that it was my birthday coming up, when my sister returned and tugged on my dad's arm. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, without looking away from the box he was holding. I think he also wished that it was his birthday coming up. "There's a man." "Oh, never mind, he's gone now." My dad looked at her, putting the box back on the shelf. "What man?" he asked. "There was a man who asked if I wanted to come see his puppy, and I said that I have to ask you first, but I don't know where he went." My dad took the box out of my hands and put it back on the shelf, then took my hand in his and put his other hand around my sister's shoulders. "Well, let's go find him," my dad exclaimed and began leading us towards the checkouts and exit. Now, like I said, this toy store was really large. We were walking very fast now. When we got near the checkouts, my sister pointed at a man who was just about to leave the store and said, "That's him." I could see how she recognized him from behind, as he had very long hair. It went halfway down his back. I remember him having a black winter coat on, which was strange because it was a pretty warm day. We walked even faster until we were at the nearest checkout, and my dad said to us, "Stay here with this nice lady for a sec," referring to the cashier. He then ran up behind the man, who was almost out of the door, and threw his hand on his shoulder so hard I could hear it. My dad spun him around to face him, then began yelling, "Where's the puppy, huh? Where's the puppy you wanted to show my daughter?" People around started looking over at the commotion, and my dad continued, "You wanted to take my daughter to see your puppy. Where is it? I want to see the puppy too." The man was stammering and stuttering and trying to get away, but my dad had a firm grasp on the guy's shoulder. Turning his head to where we were standing, my dad yelled to my sister, "Is this the guy who asked you to come see his puppy?" My sister silently nodded her head, then looked at her shoes. I think that she thought that she was in trouble. I didn't blame her. Our dad was yelling pretty loudly. "Is the puppy in your car? Where's your car? Is that it over there?" He pointed out the glass door into the parking lot. "Or is that your car? Is that where the puppy you wanted to show my 6-year-old daughter is?" I remember thinking that if he just let go of the guy, he could have led us to the puppy. Before I knew it, 3 men in yellow jackets had come. There was a word on their jackets which I couldn't read, though I knew all of the letters. SECURITY. My dad let go of the man, and the yellow fellows held him instead. My sister was crying by this point. My dad walked back to us, once again taking my hand in one of his own, and putting the other around my sister's shoulders. He asked the cashier if she had a phone he could use, and she took us to the office. He called our mum to come pick us up, then assured my sister that she wasn't in trouble. In fact, she was in the least amount of trouble anyone has ever been in the history of this world, simply by coming and asking for his permission to see the puppy. I asked him if we were still going to see it, and he just looked at me and said, "Sorry son, the puppy ran away." Our mum came in just a few minutes, and as we were leaving there were police cars pulling up. "Are they going to help find the puppy?" My sister asked my mum, but she said, "No sweetie, they're here for something else." Many years later, I remembered this incident and asked my dad about it. And apparently when the cops searched his car, they found rope, duct tape, a knife, pliers, and a hacksaw. And at the guy's apartment, they found a whole shitload of child porn. My dad and sister testified at his trial, and the guy got 20 years, which means, barring other circumstances, he's out now. So this happened approximately 2 years ago, and I almost completely pushed it out of my mind until I was reading some other people's posts here. So anyway, about 3 years ago, my mum and stepdad separated, and I, and my sister moved out and into a new place. It's in a decent neighborhood, not like a nice neighborhood, but a safe one. It's quiet and mostly elderly people and young families. So moving in, I never felt unsafe, and since this incident, I haven't either. But probably about 6 months after we moved in there were a couple of strange occurrences. One night, my mum was out for the night because she works as a relief worker for women's shelters, and the hours are pretty sporadic. So I'm 16 at the time, and stay home with my 10-year-old sister to watch her. At 9:30, I order us a pizza because we're watching a movie together, and hey, I'm a nice sister. 15 minutes later, I notice some lights outside of my house and assume it's the pizza guy, which is a little weird because they're never this fast, but I wasn't about to complain. So I get up to the window to just check and see a small blue car pulled up on the side of the road in front of my house, turned off, but the driver isn't making any move to get out of the car or any movement at all. They're just staring straight ahead. At this point, I still think it's the pizza guy, and I'm like, what the fuck? Get out and come give me my pizza. But he just keeps sitting there. Eventually, I realize this guy is not here to give me my pizza, so I sit back down and just figure that he's waiting for my neighbors to get home. Another 20 minutes passes and the pizza actually arrives, at which point I start getting uncomfortable because I notice the car is still parked outside my house and the guy has seemingly not moved. Let me explain that it's not like this person was sitting still casually in their car, or playing on their phone or listening to music like a normal person would while they wait for someone. This person was sitting straight upright with their arms rigid out in front of them on the steering wheel. Additionally, the pizza guy asked me if I knew the guy in the car before saying that he had pressed his face up against the window and stared at him as he walked by and approached my front door. So I take my pizza and eat it. Eventually, my sister passes out and I turn everything off and go upstairs. Every hour or so, I go back to check if the car and the man inside are still parked outside my house. And every time, they are, and he's still sitting there the exact same way. Until I check again at around 2 a.m. Now he's moved from the driver's side to the passenger seat and has his chin resting on his hand, looking at the window which is facing towards my house. I start getting really weirded out at this point, but still don't do anything, convincing myself that I'm overreacting. So I go upstairs and wait another hour and a half before checking again. It's like 3:30 at this point, and I think maybe the guy is waiting for me to fall asleep so he can break in and rob us or something. So this time, instead of leaving the lights off when I pull the curtain to check if he is still there, I turn them on so that he would know I was still up. I also held my phone up to my ear, hoping that he'd think I was calling the cops and leave. I didn't actually call the cops though because I figured it's technically not illegal to park on the road outside someone's house, and I didn't want it to turn out to be nothing. At this point, he starts getting out of the car. I thought he was just getting out to get back in the driver's seat, but instead, he closes the door and leans against it, putting both his hands in his pockets and just stares at me. I can't see his face because directly across the road there's a street light, so only his silhouette is visible. After maybe 30 seconds of this staring, I get too creeped out and pull the curtains and shut them again and call my mum. She's concerned and says to deadbolt the door, and if he does anything else or just doesn't get back in the car, to call the police, which I agree to do, and she hangs up. Finally, an agonizing 2 minutes later, I work up the nerve to peek out again, and he's still just standing there, staring. Now, I actually start dialing the number for the police, and just as I go to hit the call button, he abruptly looks up towards my neighbor's house and jumps back into his car. I found out the next day it's because my neighbor opened the front door and looked out at him. Apparently, he'd noticed the weird car guy too. But weird car guy still doesn't leave. He continues to sit in the car, looking towards my house until 6 a.m. I stayed up this entire time because I couldn't sleep. I don't know exactly when he decided to drive away, but the last time I checked was 6. Also, looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't call the police. So anyway, I finally go to bed and try to write it off as just a weird dude. For the next few days, I spend the nights at friends' houses and just keep busy because it was the summer holidays. When I get home, my mum tells me that every day since I've been gone, a blue car has driven past the house really slowly and honked, but she doesn't recognize the driver. And when she walked outside to take a picture of the car or license plate, it had already driven off. After it had driven by 4 times, it sped away. She called the police and reported the weird behavior, as well as gave a description of the vehicle. And they said that they would keep an eye out for any other incidents involving a car matching our description. 2 weeks after this, the car is parked outside of my house again, but no one is inside, and it sits there until it's towed away. And that's it. I never received an explanation beyond that the car was stolen over 3 months ago in a town nearly 5 hours away. And that is one of the weirdest, creepiest, unexplainable things I've ever experienced. This is a weird one. When I was in the 9th grade, there was an older boy in my science class. He barely showed up and my teacher couldn't stand him. He always wore the same beat-up jacket and brought the smell of cigarette smoke with him every time. One morning, on my way into school, he swooped in from the crowd and handed me a hot chocolate. I thanked him and kept it moving. I had been on my way into the nurse's office. Once I was alone with the nurse, she pretty much said that she saw our little exchange and that I should stay away from him. This woman had been my school nurse from kindergarten, so I took what she said to heart. After seeing him a few more times in class, he never came back to the school. Fast forward to college. I moved across the state to a school near where my mother lived. After a year or so, I start getting messages on Facebook from the kid. I was surprised he looked me up after 4 or 5 years, so I just ignored him. Then I get text messages from a random number. I knew it was him because the texts were almost as insane as the Facebook messages. He made absolutely no sense. I told him to please just leave me alone. He responded by sending me pictures he had drawn. One night, I was in a lab class and getting phone calls. I checked my voicemail, and the kid had left me a few senseless voicemails. I was more annoyed than anything, so I just ignored it. Over the next few weeks, he called a few times a day to leave voicemails. It got to the point where he filled my mailbox to capacity every single day. One day I got a text asking for my address. I sent a brief message stating that I had no clue how he even got my phone number in the first place, but he was crossing a line. I then blocked the number. Sometime after that, I got a call every evening from a number that I didn't recognize. This didn't really grab my attention for whatever reason. One day, however, I get a voicemail from the number. Basically, it went like this. Hi, my name is Cindy from... I'm calling in regards to... his doctor would like to get in touch with you. Thanks. Now, my mother sort of knew that a guy had been bothering me, but she used to work at the hospital that called. And when she called the hospital for me, she was disturbed to find out that this kid had been admitted to their mental health unit shortly after I had blocked his number. He had told his doctors, nurses, etc. that he and I were engaged. He talked about me constantly. He apparently gave consent for me to hear about him from his doctors. So my mother tells them that he's making it all up. He isn't to be trying to call me every evening anymore. The lady apparently sounded disappointed and said that the doctors would try and explain it to the kid so that he would leave me be. Well, that night, I get a ton of voicemails. Apparently, in the middle of the night, he broke out of the hospital and stole a car. He called me during this little escape to tell me that he was going to come and get me. At first, he sounded in love. He said things like, "I'm coming to you. I'm going to come and find you. We're going to go to Alaska." We're going to get married and Phoebe from Friends will be there." "Okay." He then said, "No, seriously, I'm coming to take you. You're coming with me, and I'm taking you. I'm coming to get you." And I shit you not, I heard police sirens at the end of the last voicemail. He also mentioned the street that my mum lived on. He muttered it over and over again. Needless to say, my mother took me to the police the next day. They said that, while there wasn't enough to press charges, they could take a report, and if he bothered me again, then maybe something could be done. When my mother called the hospital the next day to ask what the hell happened, they said that they couldn't disclose anything and hurried off the phone. Weeks later, I got one of those automated call requests from a correctional facility so he could speak with me. Obviously, I declined it, and I never heard from him again. If anyone doubts the validity of this story, I still have some of the messages. One of interest is an extremely long and detailed message of the house he wanted to build for us. I also could provide the news article from when he broke out and stole the car. Additionally, I believe I have at least one of the voicemails saved somewhere. Edit. Here is the final voicemail. I think this was made from a police station, and he's eerily calm compared to the calls I received from his cell during the escape. I've silenced parts where my name is mentioned.
Hey, you remember talking about Lion King, Simba's Pride? We had this whole conversation about, like on Facebook about, Lion King. Well, it's awesome. So I busted out of the hospital trying to get to you. Holding out on my mustache for you. It's your mustache. I'm you. I'm yours. You're mine. Where you want to be. Tried to get to you and got pulled. Somebody pulled over and stopped me. So I'm here at CCJ, the hospital, the jail, and it's not good. So it's always good because I'm gonna be thinking about you the entire time. I love you very much, and I'm not gonna stop talking until they pull me away. All right. So we're getting married, and Phoebe can watch from a distance. No, I'm joking. Phoebe's your favorite. She can stand right over. She can be here. Abby can be there too if you want. And we'll play Monopoly, and I'll get the Monopoly game. I'll fight for it. I'll go in there with swords. I kicked that door for you, and I flew for you. And you remember that, right? Yes, you will. Better. I love you very much. And you're with me right now, and you will always be with me. And this is going to, because I love you very much. Alright, I'm so glad you got a longer, voice message. I had so much fun in the police car, though. Like, they were playing songs that were just, like, so happy. Brought me back, and the red light above the police car, and he pulled out of this police station, went right to the yellow line, and like held it there like the whole time. It was awesome. And I swallowed it. My saliva. Alright, sorry about that. Alright, so that car is gonna be awesome when you're driving it, but in the future we're gonna go to California. We're going to Saab. We're going to Saab. So RuneScape, you'll marry me in RuneScape too after we do a whole bunch of other weddings. And we'll do your plan. We'll go forever. You're young, if you want. And yep, remember me.
My boyfriend and we love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes in university and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses and farmlands and very few people. It was off-season, so normally there would be some tourists there since the main attraction is a huge abandoned city left over from the times of ancient Greek civilization. Anyway, since there were 5 to 6 camping grounds available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the likes of, we didn't bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and then straight to the camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open. Not really so unusual, but when we entered it, no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone, but no one responded. Except the outdoor bar was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lined up and food left on the kitchen table as we saw from the window, so they couldn't have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange that they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we didn't think any more about it. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they were open. The first one we went to said that they were closed because their grounds were very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground that we had went to, and strangely, the man said don't go there. When we asked why, he said, just don't. I don't really recommend you going there. The other place he told us about was also closed, and luckily, in the meantime, I found a signboard for the first place, and it had their number on it. We called them, and a man picked up and told us that he and his wife, who ran the place, are out for a couple of hours but will be back by the evening. He said he would set up our camp and that we would meet later. The place was a bit secluded, but it was quite picturesque, and we set up our camp and left. We went the whole day exploring and hiking around, and after a tiring day, around 10 p.m, after dinner, started heading back. This is where things got extra creepy. When we got back, we found the place was still empty. No one had returned and it was quite late. My boyfriend called up the owners again. They said that they decided not to return tonight, but that we could leave the money under the table mat by the bar. They said the kitchen and the bathrooms are open if we need to use them. The place was dark, and the yard we had set the camp up was huge and without lighting. My boyfriend immediately started to feel a bit uneasy. He was concerned why 2 business owners would leave their property completely open to 2 total strangers with a bar full of unopened bottles and a half-open house. As we walked towards our camp, he kept subtly expressing his uneasiness and kept looking around. He's usually pretty calm, so I told him if he's really feeling so strongly about this, we can just go to the pension where we had dinner earlier and stay the night there in a hotel room. He opened the flashlight of his phone and kept looking around, getting more and more uneasy. We agreed to pack up our camp and leave. I began to pack it up since it requires a lot of folding, and he was already anxious. I told him to just stand and give me the light as I pack it up. Except, constantly, he would move the light and check the area, and I kept getting irritated because I could sense his worry, and at the same time, I couldn't pack up fast enough because I couldn't see. At one point, he even told me in a slightly bitchy way to hurry it up, and as soon as I folded the camp, we stuffed it into bags and hurriedly packed our shit and scooted. He still seemed super anxious, and I told him to relax. Just telling this next part gives me the chills all over again. The road back to the main area of the town was dark and lonely. This is when he told me,
"Look, there was something I wanted to say, but not while we were still in the grounds."
"Well, what is it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said that he didn't want to freak me out, but he was sure that he saw someone lurking in the dark behind the wooden cabins and by the bathrooms. Twice. No one was supposed to be there except us. I got the chills, but I still tried to rationalize, saying that it's a farm area, there's lots of animals there, maybe a cat moving around or something. But he was adamant that it was a human figure, walking like a human would and standing. That's why he kept checking and wanted to hurry so much, and that's why he was telling me to hush up and keep my voice down. I almost had tears in my eyes at this point, and the hair on the back of my neck was standing. I kept looking back and almost running at this point to the lighted area of the quiet town, and only really relaxed when we reached the pension, booked a room there, got the key, and looked and checked it twice. I am generally a skeptical person, but I really do believe that my boyfriend didn't just see things. I don't know who that was back there, or what could have happened, if anything. And I don't care to know. Dark and isolated places have always creeped me out anyway. I've always been creeped out by this experience, and figure that maybe someone here might have some insight into it. My husband, boyfriend at the time, and I were camping at Harriet Lake, which is a small lake pretty deep in the Willamette National Forest. We were on a road trip from San Francisco to Vancouver, BC at the time, and decided to spend one of the days exploring Portland for the first time, since our campsite was only about 90 minutes outside of the town. On the way back to the campsite, we approached the last stoplight in the last town before the highway narrowed to one lane in each direction. At the red light, we were pulled up next to a couple on a motorcycle. They looked to be in their 50s. The man in front was short and pudgy, while the woman was tall and lanky. I joked to my husband that they looked like Boris and Natasha from the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. When the light turned green, they looked over at us, took off, cut in front of us, and disappeared quickly down the curvy road ahead. I remember us thinking we had somehow pissed them off because they were driving really aggressively. Soon after, we found ourselves deep in the forest. The winding road was flanked by cliffs on the left and the sparkling rushing Clackamas River on the right. Several small, old green metal bridges passed over the winding river. Cell signals quickly disappeared, the sun was setting, and there were very few other people around, except for a few fishermen trying to get one last catch before the sun went down for the night. As we approached the last bridge before the turnoff that led to the campground, we noticed that Boris and Natasha were parked sideways in the middle of the bridge. As we got closer to them, we realized that they were staring at us, as if they were waiting for us. I noticed that Natasha was holding something in her hand. Whatever it was producing a fair amount of smoke. I thought maybe we had come across them smoking a cigar or a blunt or something. As we slowed down and prepared to pass them on the bridge, I got a closer look at whatever was in her hand and realized that there was way too much smoke coming from it. Right as we were passing them, she tossed the smoking object under our car, and they scooted off the bridge, then turned around and looked at us like they were waiting for something. My husband had the quick thinking to swerve and accelerate out of there, and not a moment too soon, as the object exploded forcefully right after our car cleared it. Boris and Natasha, having failed to accomplish whatever their goal was, disable our car and rob us, kidnap us, or kill us or something, sped off down a side road. While my husband was furious, I was totally freaked out. I was convinced that they were following us, or had been following us earlier in the day. I was 100% certain that they would return to our campsite in the night, where we were defenseless in our tent, and finish the job and get rid of the witnesses. But fortunately, we never saw them again. I'm not really sure how to explain this. I was babysitting a 4-year-old about 2 weeks ago, as his mother had to go to work and his grandmother that usually watches him was at the hospital due to some sort of medical issues. Everything went fine as the day went by. Me and the 4-year-old spent the whole day playing games and watching TV in the living room. It was getting close to his bedtime, so I gave him a snack and told him it's time to put on his PJs, and he started to act up a little bit like most kids do when bedtime comes around. So I endured the tantrum and put him in his room anyway. He laid down and I put a movie on for him in his room and walked out and left the door open a crack. I made my way to the living room in the hall and started watching TV. I turned the TV down so I could hear if the 4-year-old was getting up and walking around. I didn't hear anything at first except for the movie I'd put on for him. But after about 5 minutes went by, I heard the TV in the boys' room turn up really loud. So I ran in and the boy was laying in the bed with a weird expression on his face. I couldn't tell if he did it or not. So I told him not to touch the TV and he looked at me and said that it wasn't him, it was the man. So I got kind of creeped out and asked what man, and he pointed towards a huge teddy bear so I just ignored it and went back to watching TV, when all of a sudden I hear a man's voice talking really low. It was almost like someone in a different room on the phone, trying not to be heard. I turned the TV off and listened to make sure I was really hearing it, and sure enough, I did. So I got up, as scared as I was, and made my way to the bedroom of the boy. And I saw something in front of the crack of the door, covering most of the crack. So I pushed the door open, and the life-size teddy bear fell from behind the door. I looked up to see the boy under his blanket sitting upright on his bed. I walked in the room and said what's wrong as I was scoping out the rest of the room because I was sure that I heard a man's voice, but I saw nothing. So I said again, "What's wrong? I'm not mad if you're up playing." He peeked out of his blanket and said that the man was scaring him. This time, I was really, really nervous. So I asked, "What is this man doing?" And the boy said that he wants to give you a boo-boo, aka this man wants the boy to hurt me. So I didn't ask any more questions. I went over and picked the 4-year-old up and we started walking towards the door, when I heard a few toys start going off across the room as I was shutting the door. Then I heard something smash against the wall, and the 4-year-old said that he's very angry, and when he said that, it gave me chills. So I ended up running to the other end of the house at this point with the 4-year-old in my arms while we were both crying. I locked myself and the boy in the mother's room and called her. She didn't answer, so I was stuck there with her son babysitting till she came home at 12 at night. I waited in the mother's bedroom and put her son to bed in the mother's bed. And for the rest of the time I was there, alone with the boy in the mum's room, I didn't hear anything. I told the mother everything when she came home, and she said that her son says stuff about a man and different stuff like that. She laughed, almost like it was a joke or something. All I know is that I'll never babysit there ever again. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was really beautiful. As I now am 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night, I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in, usually up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look out through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So, as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in, a sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying, faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered off into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother for help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time that I'd ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A grey tape recorder, one of the biggest that I'd ever seen, was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees that I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home, and nothing else. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all of the lights off as I went into my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadows. But nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest again. When I was 21, I transferred to a college in San Francisco. I checked out a room for rent on Craigslist. It was in a really nice 2-bedroom apartment. It was cheap rent and close to campus, so it was the ideal spot. The girl who lived there was 29, and her name was Beth. She was tall and wide, and she had jet black hair and wore pale makeup. She seemed nice, although a little quiet, but she seemed to like me and agreed to let me move in. My first night there, we went out for pizza. That's when I could tell that something was a little bit off with her. Throughout the dinner, she kept telling me how much I looked like Shia LaBeouf. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged it off with a thanks. I mean, I looked nothing like Shia LaBeouf, so it just didn't make any sense to me. When we got back home, she asked if I'd seen her room yet. I said no, and so she took me in to see it. Her walls were covered in posters of Shia LaBeouf. She even had printed out photos of him all over her mirror. She owned all of his movies. Honestly, I didn't know what to make of it. It was creepy. The whole night she had been saying that I look like him, and now it's obvious to me that she's obsessed with the guy. A few weeks passed and I never really saw her that much. We didn't spend any time together really. She would come home from work and practically run to her room. She would spend the whole night in there. She had this creepy high-pitched giggle, and I would hear her giggling through the walls all night. I wondered what the hell she could possibly be doing in there. Occasionally she would come out and talk for like 2 minutes, and she would always be slurring her words. So I suspected that she was drinking a lot. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything and she would just stand in the hallway and watch me in the living room. I would turn and see her and be surprised and say, hello Beth. Then there would be this long, awkward pause, and she would give out her creepy, high-pitched giggle. It was really uncomfortable being around her. She gave me the chills. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard what sounded like the front door being unlocked. I came out of my bedroom and all the lights were off, but I could still see Beth standing at the front door. She had her face against it, and she was turning the lock back and forth, over and over again, and every time she turned the bolt, she mumbled my name. Seeing her standing in the dark and mumbling my name really freaked me out, and it doesn't help that she kinda looks like a bigger version of the girl from The Ring. I just quietly went back to my room and tried to sleep. One night, I was watching Gladiator and she stumbled out of her room and turned on the living room light, forcing me to pause the movie, which was annoying. She then asked me if I wanted to hear about her ex-boyfriend. It was an uneasy segue into the topic, but I said sure and then awkwardly sat back to listen to her. 10 minutes into her story and she was so riled up. She was screaming at the top of her lungs about their breakup. I was worried that the neighbors were going to call the cops, and she wasn't listening to me when I was asking her to lower the volume. Amidst of all of her screaming, one thing she said really freaked me out. She was in such a fit and yelled, "I'll slit his fucking throat!" That was a big game changer. Suddenly, I had no idea what this girl was capable of. She was practically a stranger, and everything I had seen was becoming alarmingly disturbing. After a few more minutes, she told me thanks for listening and started doing her giggle. I got out of there pretty fast and went to my room to go to sleep. I had a pretty unsettled feeling about being in the house with her, and what's worse is that there was no lock on my bedroom door. I pushed the edge of my dresser in front of it to act as a little barricade. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dresser scraping against the floor. Beth was pushing the door open. I turned on my light, shouting at her to stop. I could see her through the opening of the door. She was so drunk and had this insane look in her eyes. I pushed the door closed and yelled at her to go to bed. I could hear her walk back to her room, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning when I went out into the hallway, my heart dropped. I saw one of her steak knives was on the floor by my door. I got goosebumps all over my arms. All I could think about was her saying she would slit the guy's throat. I confronted her about it. She said that she didn't remember trying to push my door open. She said that she didn't even remember telling me about her ex. I'd had enough at this point. My lease was month to month, so I found a new spot and moved out. About a month after I moved out, she contacted me. I was at the movies and my phone was off. When I got out, I turned my phone on, and to my shock, I received 40 plus text messages that she had sent to me over the past 2 hours. They were all just insane texts that ranged from everything between, "Hi, how are you?" to, "I fucking hate you." It was honestly crazy. I didn't respond and I never heard from her again. I always wonder if I hadn't set my dresser in front of my door, would she have quietly come into my room and slit my throat? It freaks me out. I would like to give a little background on my story before I begin. I was around 14 years old and female. I'm 25 now, and I lived in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania, surrounded by cornfields and woods. The house I lived in was an old trailer, so it was long but not wide. This will be important. My family owned the land behind our house, and there were around 70 acres, so the only neighbor we had was across the street, and they mainly kept to themselves. With this being said, we never locked our front door. We had a back door, but the hinges were rusted shut, so we had always just kept it locked because no one was coming in or out of it. My mother was going through a midlife crisis, as I like to say, because she was drinking all the time and had a multitude of different guy friends whom she'd always bring around, me and my brother, who was around 10 at the time. At one point, during this crisis, she brought home a man. His name was Dan. He was an okay guy, but something always struck me as odd about him, but I just couldn't place the feeling. I was young at the time and knew a little bit about what he was doing, drugs, crimes, etc. However, I didn't know everything, and I am glad I did not know at the time. After about a week of non-stop partying, they became an item, and not long after he moved in, which meant that his 15-year-old son came too. The son, Sam, he was nothing like his father. Sam was a very polite and respectful person, and I remember on multiple occasions asking him how he turned out so great, and his response was always the same: "I don't want to be like my dad." After about 6 months, I had forgotten the odd feeling, or pushed it aside, and we had turned into a dysfunctional family. We had our ups and downs, but knowing that someone was there who was around my age made things seem a little less horrible. Many nights while my mother and Dan were going out and doing who knows what with who knows who, the three of us were left home alone, which, as kids, we thought was the best thing in the world. Sam and I would send my brother to bed around 9 p.m. and we would stay up listening to music and playing guitar until we saw headlights, and then we would run to our rooms and pretend like we had been asleep all night. One night, around midnight, we were sitting in the living room and Sam decided to put on his headphones, which were connected to a speaker system so he could play his guitar without waking my brother. I don't know anything about speaker systems, so I apologize if this is not right. I only know what he told me and what I heard. He was playing and recording a song when, all of a sudden, he stopped and looked over at me, a little confused. I smiled and asked him why he'd stopped, and he put his finger to his mouth to silently shush me. I started to get a little worried and took a quick look around the house and saw nothing. He took his headphones off slowly, putting them down, and he walked to the front door. We have always had a blanket covering on our front door, and I always thought it was for keeping the light out, and he lifted the blanket just enough to see the doorknob. He instantly clicked the deadbolt to the lock position and pointed for me to move to the floor. I was freaking out at this point, and I did as he wanted and laid down flat on the floor. He slowly crept over to me so as not to make a sound. All the while, his eyes were fixed on the front door. When he made his way over to me, he very slowly laid himself down next to me and held my hand. I had my head buried into the corner of my arm and was silently sobbing, and every time I looked up, he would shake his head no, and I would begin crying all over again. We laid there like this until 3 a.m. when we saw headlights coming up from the kitchen window, and I felt his grip on my hand ease up. I looked up and sighed and asked softly if we're okay now. He looked at me and said yes. I felt like I could breathe again, but there was still this knot in the bottom of my stomach because I still had no idea why we had just laid on the floor for 3 hours in silence. Sam got up to unbolt the front door, but he stopped when he got to the speakers, and I watched as he turned off the record button. He walked me to my room and told me that he would explain it in the morning because he didn't want to get caught out of bed. I laid in my room and listened to my mother and Dan laughing in the kitchen and slurring their words. They had fought for a bit, and then, I assumed, decided to go to bed. And then there was silence. It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I started to sob. And at some point, I had shed my last tear, and I fell into a nightmare. Around 6 a.m., I had jolted up from my bed, and I was completely drenched in a sweat. I had no memory of my dream, but I knew that it was nothing compared to what I was about to face when I saw Sam. As soon as my feet hit the floor, I bolted for the door. I had to know why we had spent 3 hours in utter fear that night. As soon as I had swung the door open, I saw Sam standing by my door. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked as if he'd aged 5 years. Are you okay?" were the first words that spilled out of my mouth as he shook his head back and forth. I instantly remembered why he looked the way he did. "I need to know why." He cut me off and spoke in a very heavy voice. "Come with me." He grabbed my hand and pulled me down the hallway towards the living room and sat me in front of the speakers. He gestured for me to put the headphones on, and I took a deep breath and did. He pushed some buttons, and all of a sudden I could hear the guitar playing in my ears. I was blankly staring in front of me, trying to figure out what I was supposed to hear. Sam turned another knob, and the playing got louder, and in the middle of a chord ending, I could hear a rattling sound. The sound was not something you hear all the time, but it was a sound that I could immediately place. It was the sound of a door jiggling. My eyes widened, and my heart felt as if it was going to burst out of my chest. I heard my voice come through the headphones, asking why he had stopped playing. And then I heard another voice. It was deep and almost demonic, and it said,
"Let's try the front door."
I heard footsteps fade away, and then a click, which I knew was Sam deadbolting the front door. There were sounds of us moving around, and then silence. Then I heard the footsteps again. I could hear them climbing the stairs and then moving the doorknob ever so slightly, and I could hear crying in the background, which is why I think I didn't hear the doorknob moving. After about 10 seconds, I heard the same dark voice.
Fuck it, we'll have to come back when they're home.
I felt tears running down my face as I heard his words. I ripped the headphones off and told Sam that we had to tell my mum and his dad. He agreed and we ran to their bedroom and opened the door. I was scared to wake them up, so Sam said that he would, and he walked over and told his dad that he needed to talk to him. When they finally got out of the bed, we took them out and let them listen to the recording. I watched as they both got a look of pure terror across their faces, and then his dad reached up and hit some buttons and told us both not to let anyone know. I found out later that day from Sam that his dad had erased the recording. We sat down and had a family meeting that day and discussed a code word and where we would go if someone ever broke into the house. I remember begging them to call the cops, but every time I mentioned it, they would yell at me and tell me not to say a word to anyone. So, we kept our mouths shut. I still to this day do not know why we were not allowed to call the cops. The only thing I could figure was that his dad was big into drugs and did not want the cops snooping around. Every time I asked my mother about the whole situation, she shuts me down and tells me that the past should stay in the past. So 2 months had passed by, and after the events from the previous months, Sam, my brother, and myself were not left as home as much during the first month. The following month, however, my mother and Dan had begun to go out more and more, leaving us to fend for ourselves. The three of us sort of stuck together whenever we were home alone. We would constantly double check the locks to make sure that we were locked in tight. When it was time for my brother to go to bed, Sam and I would sit in the hallway outside of his bedroom door with our pocket knives clenched in our fists, just listening. Every small noise would make my heart skip a beat, and with every sound, I truly believed that we were going to die. This went on for a few weeks, and with each passing day, Sam and I felt a little better, telling ourselves that they would have come back by now if they were going to. My mother and Dan had pretty much brushed it off, or at least, that's how it felt. After about a month, they started going out more often, and once again, we were at home, all alone, almost every night. My grades had started to slip, which was the result of a lack of sleep. I had started to fall asleep in class because, in my mind, I was safe there. Even though Sam and I had started feeling more at ease, we would still sit in the darkness and wait until we saw those bright, beautiful headlights coming through the kitchen window. About 2 months later, we had received our report cards in the mail. I had always been in charge of getting the mail after school, and when I opened mine, I was in complete shock. I knew that I had been missing homework assignments and not doing well on tests, but when I saw the 2 Fs on my report card, I was in disbelief. I held on to it, along with Sam's and my brother's for the rest of the week, for fear of getting in trouble. Friday had rolled around, and I knew I had to hand them over to my mother. So when I got off of the bus, I walked to the mailbox and casually acted as if I was just pulling them out. I slowly made my walk of shame to the front door, and when I walked in, to my surprise, my mother wasn't home. I laid the report cards, along with the other mail, on the counter and sat down on the couch, awaiting my punishment. My mother and Dan didn't come home until almost 9 p.m. that night though, which was very unlike them. They may have went out almost every night, but they were always there to greet us from the bus. In the 5 hours it took for them to get home, I remember becoming more and more angry. At one point, the feeling of dread washed over me that maybe something had happened, but I had pushed it aside and focused on how mad I was. When they walked through the door, I remember saying something to my mother along the lines of, "Where have you been?" which sent her into a fury. One thing you don't do is talk back to my mother, especially when she had been drinking. She began to yell and scream at me, telling me things along the lines of, "Mind your own damn business," and "Who the hell do you think you are to ask me this?" The anger I had accumulated in the past 5 hours finally let loose, and this was the first time and last time I stood my ground and let her have it. We were in a screaming match for probably about 5 minutes when I'd had enough. I stormed out of the house and slammed the door. It was a beautiful night. There were some stars in the sky and big storm clouds passing overhead. I remember at some point that night I heard thunder, but I was too caught up in the anger to give it even a second thought. When I walked down my steps, I remember hearing the sound of twigs snapping, and I turned my head. thinking that it was a deer or some other wildlife. It was not uncommon to find a group of deer standing in our yard. At that very moment, when I had turned my head, lighting filled the sky, and it was like someone had turned a light on outside. And there, standing inside the yard, were two men. I can't tell you what they were wearing, or what they looked like, because my eyes had landed on something more terrifying than the fact that they were standing in my yard. Even though I only saw them for a few seconds, the images of their guns were what my mind had focused on. The moment the sky turned black again, I screamed as loud as I could. I was surrounded in almost complete darkness, the only light source being the kitchen window and the faint glow that was cast on the ground. Within seconds of my scream, I heard the front door fly open, and Sam was running out towards me with my mother, Dan, and brother in tow. All I could do was point towards the side yard and sob uncontrollably. And right then, we all heard the sound of car doors slamming shut. As I looked towards the road, I could see the faint glow of red, and I heard the sound of tires speeding away. Sam pulled me into him, and I lost it. I couldn't stop crying because I knew that we had almost died. Once back in the safety of our house, I told my family what had happened, and without saying a word, Dan grabbed his gun from inside the drawer and walked out the door. I have no clue what happened between the time he left and when he returned 2 hours later, but I remember him hugging me and telling me that we were safe now. He refused to speak about the incident afterwards, and I never saw those men or Dan's gun ever again. This story happened when I was around 10 years of age and involves 4 of my childhood friends. I am a 28-year-old female and I'm from a very country southern state. This was the most awful thing I've been through in my life. This story takes place back in the mountains. I was always so excited to see the weekend approaching, partly because I had a pretty cool mum. She would take me to places with my friends and pretty much let us have a little freedom. I also got to spend weekends with my friends. So, my friend Belinda asked if she could come spend the weekend with me. I asked my mum and she said yes. I waited until her mum dropped her off at the bottom of my hill and walked down to meet her. We walked excitedly back to my house. My mum then said that her best friend Chris, who is female, called and asked if we wanted to come up to their mountain home for a visit. So my mum asked if Belinda and I wanted to go, and we replied with a yes. Chris's kids are Alan and Jay, who happen to be 2 of my best friends. Belinda had a crush on Alan and I was secretly in love with Jay. We left our house within 10 minutes and ascended to their home. As I said, they lived on top of a huge mountain, and where they lived, there was really dense forest for miles. So after 20 minutes of driving, we finally made it to their home. My mum went in and was greeted by Chris. Belinda and I stayed out to talk to Alan and Jay, who also had a few other friends with them. We knew everyone there and we talked with them. Scott was the oldest, Jay the second oldest. Then there was Ray, and then Alan, being the youngest. They all kept going on and on about this cabin that they had built far out into the woods. It was probably about 3 miles into the forest from their house. The boys wanted to take us down to explore it, and we agreed. I was used to roaming half of these woods, and I always loved venturing out into them. I grew up there my whole life. That all changed after this. We told them we had to ask my mum and use the bathroom before we could go. They snickered, jumped into their ATVs, screamed that they were going on ahead of us, and tell us to follow when we're done. We go into the house, use the restroom, and ask my mum if we could go. We're in a hurry to catch up to the boys, so she says yes quickly, but we have to be careful. So we quickly race out of the house. We start walking down the hill to descend to the main dirt road. We had to walk approximately half of a mile to get to the road that led to the cabin. It was all mostly downhill, except for the flat main bottom road. We skipped merrily along, talking about the guys as we were going. They always liked playing pranks and jokes on me, since I was like their sister and grew up with them. So I told Belinda that I had a feeling that they were going to jump out and scare us or something. Little did I know, I was in for a different surprise. We walked about another 2.5 miles to finally reach this cabin. It felt like it took forever, as it wasn't a road, but a path. When we finally reach it, no one is on the site. We walk onto the little porch and knock on the door, waiting for one of the guys to jump out and try to scare us. We step back and marvel at the little cabin. Jay really did do a good job on it. He was always into building, creating, and growing things. We finally check the door and step into a little room. The cabin only had 2 rooms. It wasn't very big at all, and no one appears to be inside or in the general area. All we can hear are sounds of wildlife. So we stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. It was then that we heard the ATV a little ways above the cabin, not back towards the main road, but further down the path. So we follow the sounds and finally see the guys. They're speeding off on down the path and stop long enough to yell at us to keep following them and take off down the path of the woods. We both groan really loudly. Belinda expresses concern and just wants to go back the way that we came to the house. It was probably around 3 in the evening and she didn't want to be out in the woods anymore. I, on the other hand, was a little explorer. I wanted to keep going down the path, thinking that somehow we could find the guys and possibly prank them. And boy, do I regret doing that now. In fact, I should have kicked their butts after this little escapade. So we take off farther down the path after I talk Belinda into it. We walk for like 2 hours before we both realize that we're lost. We came to a fork in a road, and there stood a tree with 2 arrows pointing to either side of the split in the road. I forgot to mention that it was summertime and the daylight was long. It doesn't get dark here until around 8ish in the summer. We had walked for probably about 2 hours in total so far, and seriously didn't know which side to go to. My friend started to panic a bit, and I tried to calm her down, assuring her that we had plenty of daylight ahead and that we would make it back in plenty of time. Although, I wasn't so sure of that anymore. We were about 7 miles into the woods that were endless at this time. I had no idea of our location, so we both decided to stick towards the right of the mountain. Belinda was laughing and saying that she was going to kick their butts later. I laughed and we made plans to get them back. We walked for what seemed like forever, and somehow ended up back at the split in the road. It was then growing a little bit darker, nearing dusk with every minute. By this time, my friend and I were totally freaking out. She was sobbing and asking me how we're going to find our way back out. I tried to stay calm and reassure her that we would make it back, but on the inside, I was just as scared as she was. At that time, we stood frozen to the road, trying to figure out where to go next. And that's when, about 15 yards back, I heard a twig snap. I shushed Belinda and asked her did she hear that. She started smiling and was about to call out to our guy friends. I stopped her suddenly, telling her to stay quiet for a minute. We continued to hear the footsteps. For some reason, I felt more terrified than I ever had in my life. I whispered for Belinda to start walking slowly down the left fork. The footsteps kept inching closer to our location. We tried to be as quiet as we could, but leaves were all around us. For some reason, I knew that these footsteps didn't belong to our friends. I had the awful feeling of dread, and my friend started to pick up on that. As the footsteps started sounding closer and faster, I decided to book it down this path and my friend followed. I just felt like I was running for my life, and if I slowed down, I wasn't going to ever make it back or go home again. We finally reached this embankment off the side of the path, so we decided to climb up it. I tore into the mountainside with my feet and my legs and scratched myself along the way. We finally see a barn up ahead of us, which was old and had not been used in a long time. The footsteps still approached us after a short pause. My guess is that they were quieter as they reached the mountain. Also, we had now descended into tall grassy fields, which made it easier to mask any sounds. As I finally realized our surroundings, I remembered their family graveyard was up ahead of the barn. It was very old and had some really large headstones, as well as some crypts. I decided that that was probably our best chance to hide and get a view of who this person was chasing us. So we ran through the old iron gate and hid behind the largest tomb we could find. It grew very quiet as we stood frozen. My mind was racing, my body was shaking, and my heart was beating beyond control. Who the hell was chasing us from the woods? What did they want from us? I had so many questions. questions that may never get answered. Belinda and I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was more around about 10 minutes. It gave us a chance to calm down, correct our breathing, and cool down from our run. We finally decided to stand up halfway so that we could see if anyone was around us. We crept up to our feet, still crouching behind the grave, and what we both saw literally about made us pee our pants. There, at the beginning of the cemetery, stood a man. He was probably about 6 feet tall, appeared to weigh about 170 pounds, and was wearing dark clothing. His eyes looked very dark and wild. He stood there searching the graveyard with his eyes, trying to listen for us. We both immediately ducked back down behind the stone. We both started breathing heavily again, scared to death that he had saw us raise up. Belinda shot me a look as the man started rustling around. I peered up again, and his gaze met mine. He then turned his body towards our hiding place, locked his gaze on me, and smiled a wicked smile. He then said,
There you are.
I didn't even hesitate. I screamed to Belinda, and we both jumped up and started running towards the back of the cemetery fence. The man started chasing behind us, but luckily for us, this cemetery had a very short fence, so we hurriedly hopped over and began to run in the direction of the house. We ran out of the clearing and reached the gravel road. We didn't slow down or stop or even look behind us. We just ran as fast as we could towards the house. The gravel lay up beneath our feet. We made it part ways there, and at the bottom of their road, the boys all stood, looking very worried. We ran up to them so fast that they jumped. I ran into Scott's arms, crying with Belinda right beside me. She was crying too, both of us looking a hot mess, bleeding from the earlier climb, sweaty, and our appearance very disheveled. We suddenly turned, remembering the reason for our panic, to see a man running back towards the graveyard with Scott, Jay, and Alan all screaming and chasing after him. And we never saw the man again. The boys chased him into the woods, but couldn't catch up with him, so they came back and walked us up to the house. They all started crying, feeling really bad for trying to mess with us earlier, our parents waiting on us scared to death. Jay and the boys admitted to leaving us and taking off in the woods, thinking that it was funny and that we would find our way back home. As it grew later, they all began to worry about us and had went back through to search for us. When they couldn't find us, they went to all of our parents and admitted what they did. They all went to search for us and started to panic when they couldn't find us. Chris was actually on the phone with 911 when we arrived, about to send search and rescue out for us. We had been gone for close to 5 hours. We told them the story and about the man who followed us. The police showed up to question us all and ask for the man's description. They searched the woods and the mountain, but there wasn't a trace of him. The boys all got grounded for playing their tricks, but quite honestly, they were all shook up about it though. They thought that they would never see us again, scared because it was getting dark. They felt guilty about the man and thought it was their fault. Needless to say though, we forgave them. But I never went back to that cabin or to that part of the woods again. G'day mates, it's Busta here. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video guys. And you know, that story about the ghost in the kids' room, I think that the ghost was really trying to get that kid to hurt that babysitter. In fact, I would say that he was dead serious. I'm here till Thursday. Thanks again to the Hive members that bravely shared their story for us all here, and I hope you guys are all doing really well. For the chance to have your story feature in a video, you can send your story to my email, which is in the description below. And as always, keep them coming guys, as this channel relies upon your stories to continue. Also guys, please do me a favor and just state in your email what your story is about in the description, and also provide me with a short written statement of consent, just so that I can be above board with everything. And also remember to tell me in the email if you would like to remain anonymous, and please change any names if you don't want particular names to be shared. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates throughout the week. Also, don't forget about Twitch and Discord. Make sure you follow me there too, guys. You can also catch me on my second channel, all of which I'll have links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, for all the love and support, and I'll see you, mates, in the next one.